Based on the rugged, windswept terrain that was Coyote Pass, Kody Brown presented a canvas that was supposed to convince fans of M's sister wives, endless skies, custom-built houses, a shared destiny where he and his plural family could at long last live happily ever after. He talked about building a legacy that would be left for his children and his grandchildren. For a long time, he seemed convincing. In particular, Janelle was not just emotionally connected to Coyote Pass, she was also financially. She believed in it when no one else did. She was fighting for it during interviews when viewers wondered why there were obstacles. At the same time that tension was building between Kody and other wives, Janelle remained steadfast in believing that if they developed the land, everything else would take care of itself. But year after year, there was just a sense that things were not. Coyote Pass remained just as it was on the day that the Browns purchased it, empty land. It had no foundations laid, no construction teams working on it, and there was no timeline for its construction either. The dream that Kody was so passionate about selling would never progress beyond words. Backstage, the beginnings of cracks appeared. This cost of land was already stretching the family's finances thin. Loans were being taken out, common investments were being made, and complex ownership patterns were being set up. Different names were being attached to each plot of land, a matter that was disregarded early on, but would prove important later on. So-called family property was showing signs of being a legal time bomb just waiting to go off. Then, of course, there was Kody's leadership or lack thereof. As the family fell apart, Kody's attention wandered. His interest shifted entirely to Robyn and her family. Coyote Pass meetings grew heated or stalled. Decisions were delayed. Deadlines passed. The sense of urgency that propelled the Coyote Pass project disappeared. Janelle Brown tried to move forward with her questions about the infrastructure, zoning laws, and the cost of building. But every time, she was met with the same response: delay, excuse, deflection. Kody was talking about problems rather than solutions. He was blaming the economy, the family dynamic, the city, anything but himself. However, Janelle also managed. This decision left many viewers stunned. As she moved to reside in the trailer on the land, it wasn't the nicest or easiest decision, but for her, it symbolized that she was willing to suffer for the present, so that she could have a great future down the line when the prospects at Coyote Pass materialize. Kody, however, just saw this as a hassle for him. It made a difference. As Janelle tried to press ahead, it seemed like Kody got bogged down not only in the land but in the concept of joint responsibility. The more she tried to get things moving, the more she felt pushed back. Communication became frosty. Teamwork gave way to frustration. Something that had started as a joint venture began to seem like an act of solo sacrifice. But then came the realization that turned everything on its head. Janelle realized that Coyote Pass was not being held back by unfortunate circumstances. It was being held back because Kody did not want it to proceed, at least not in the manner it impact everyone equally. Control had substituted vision. As long as the land remained undeveloped, Kody remained in charge. Kody could promise what he wanted with no expectation of follow-through. Kody could keep the wives hung up on the notion of a future that never existed. And as long as the land remained up in the air, no one stood a chance of completely backing out. For Janelle, this was devastating news. Years of her loyalty, her financial resources, her faith were all tied up in this plan. And this plan was no longer real. The legacy she was helping to establish was no longer being established, but was instead being used for collateral. And once that realization dawned on her, she couldn't unsee it. The statements became more pointed. Conversations about money became awkward. Janelle started asking Kody questions he didn't want to hear, about equality, about possession, about responsibility. Defensive responses came instead of explanations. Silence followed instead of answers. This silence spoke volumes. The Coyote Pass was not anymore a shared dream. It was an incomplete project that had emotional strings attached. For the first time, Janelle started to consider a future without that land, without waiting, without begging for progress. The idea was a kind of horror but also a liberation. Because if Coyote Pass wasn't going to be built, perhaps it wasn't intended to be her future to begin with, and that was just the start of the end. Because that is the moment Janelle stopped believing in Kody's dream. Not just for the land, however, for Kody's control over her life. The thing Kody did not understand at that point was, once Janelle was mentally out from under Coyote Pass, he was about to see his underlying power foundation start coming apart. His family's vision, which was meant to hold them all together, was about to blow all that was wrong apart. It finally took a step back when Janelle Brown left Kody. But this wasn't done with pyrotechnics or the dramatic slamming of the door. There no screaming match caught on tape. No single incident that the viewers could pinpoint as the point where the relationship ended. As has been seen before, it actually ended quietly, as many do when the end is emotionally driven. She no longer felt compelled to explain herself. She no longer waited for permission. Moreover, she stopped thinking that remaining in a relationship marked loyalty. For so many years, Janelle had been the stable one, the sensible wife, the fixer. When things got emotional, she turned to reasoning. When things got tight, she held things together. When Kody presented his half-baked notions, she was the one trying to bring them to fruition. However, something happened after Coyote Pass failed yet again, and yet again, and yet again. Janelle noticed that it wasn't just in the case of the land that she could see a pattern emerging. It was emerging in every aspect of their marriage. Because every time she had asked for an answer, she had been encouraged to exercise patience. Every time she had asked for equity, she had been labeled as being demanding. Every time she had raised issues, she had felt that she was upsetting the family when really she had been working to protect herself. This was harder to accept than any fight could ever be. Leaving wasn't just about Kody. It was all about reclaiming herself. Initially, the separation was very burdensome. Years of common history did not just melt away in a single night. There were children, memories, and sacrifices that came with a life that was shaped by a framework that was now gone. But the separation did the unthinkable. It strengthened her. It brought Janelle solace. It was the first time in years that she did not have to negotiate her self-worth. She did not have to struggle to be heard or to fit into a system that ceased to valuing her input. Instead, she concentrated on taking care of her physical health and her independence and future as a woman by herself and not as a component of a plural family. The change was noticed by fans almost immediately. Janelle appeared lighter. She spoke more clearly. She stopped apologizing for her need for more. And while Kody was unraveling in public, airing his frustrations, pointing fingers, and holding on to control, Janelle was mum. She didn't jump to defend herself. She didn't play the blame game. This was not weakness. It was strength. This was when life brought her something that she was not looking for, but was really in need of: a different type of man. Janelle's new beau did not come with words of fanfare or showy actions. He did not seek to outdo all the experiences she already had. What he brought was, instead, much more potent: consistency. He listened. He respected other people's boundaries, spoke with Janelle as an equal, not as a supporting character in another person's story, and perhaps most importantly, he did not try to control her. After all those years of living in a system in which the flow of decisions was one way, this was a difference that couldn't be ignored. There was a balance to the conversations. A disagreement did not become a power play. There was no feeling of guilt that came along with independence. For Janelle, this was revolutionary. This wasn't a rescue mission. This was a journey into the future with this woman. And as the trust grew, another thing became apparent. This man cared for her not only emotionally, he cared about her future. Unlike Kody, who was always speaking in concepts and plans, this new husband of Janelle's was speaking in realities. He was asking questions. He was considering long-term results. And when Janelle began to share with him some of her gripes about Coyote Pass, the delays, the ineffectiveness, the disproportionate cost, he didn't dismiss her concerns. He leaned forward. He wanted to understand what she had invested. He wanted to know what she is rightfully entitled to. Q2, what is your understanding of? Wanted to safeguard all that she had strived for. That alone made him unique. He made me feel like my worries are problems he can solve. This was what Janelle needed. Years was the answer Mary Williams received to her question about how long Dr. Forsyth's availability would last. I've told Kody things before. This needs to happen before that needs to happen. His reaction? Not till I'm good and behind it all. Janelle started to grasp, quietly, without fanfare, something that hurt more than anything that Janelle ever argued with Kody about. This is what a partnership is supposed to be like. There is no competition for attention. Hierarchy. There is no holding back in. Just mutual respect. While Janelle was piecing her life together, Kody was struggling to comprehend what was taking place. She was always someone I knew I could depend on, someone who would keep her head and be steady, no matter how shattered things may get. And then she wanted to be independent. Her happiness troubled him, and her unwillingness to play along with the mess only irritated him more. While Kody was hashing out issues of loyalty in relationships, Janelle concentrated on building stability. While he was dwelling in the past, it appears Janelle began working towards building a secure future, and one that included a new relationship. This was no rebound. This wasn't revenge. This was growth. The difference revealed everything Kody had been taking for Granted, Janelle no longer had to explain her decision. She didn't need anyone's approval in regards to putting herself first. And she definitely didn't need to be committed to something that was never realized. Her new husband didn't promise her land or legacy. Instead, he promised her security, honesty, and follow-through. And that made all the difference. But there was more to it than that. It was not simply exactly what Kody did not understand was this: when Janelle walked away, she did not lose any stability. She found it. Also, with her immersing herself in a relationship where things were run through respect rather than control, there was a shift in the balance of power. The woman who used to wait for decisions was now taking her own decisions. The wife who believed in another man's dream is now working towards her own dream. Coyote Pass no longer defined her, but it still defined Kody, and soon, that would come back to haunt him because Janelle wasn't just moving on emotionally years ago. Kody often spoke as if Coyote Pass was a done deal. He stood on the property and pointed at the mountains in front of him as if taking possession. Sometimes he mentioned his vision there as if he owned the place. It all seemed as if Coyote Pass was waiting for him in order to be developed. But confidence does not mean ownership. And once Janelle had finally removed herself from the marriage, this illusion had begun to break down. What most fans didn't quite grasp at first was this: Coyote Pass was never a straightforward thing. It wasn't a single clean purchase with a single straightforward owner. It was broken up into separate parcels with separate names associated with them, separate financial interests underlying them, and separate hopes regarding its ultimate division. These things had always been there, but no one made Kody look at them. Until now. It isn't until Janelle started seriously discussing her future that the question of the land couldn't be left unresolved anymore. For years, she believed that only time was needed, that what was needed would eventually happen, that Kody would do the right thing, but enough was enough of her patience this time. She did not react emotionally to the situation. She reacted to the situation in the right way with the help of her new husband. Janelle began asking Kody questions he couldn't avoid. Not questions that were dramatic. Not questions that were argued. Just questions that were rooted in reality. Who paid what? Who owned what land? Who was on what assessment roll? Who owned what was preventing it from happening? What was the plan in writing? Mrs. Graham was not. These weren't attacks, they were demands for accountability. This is precisely what made them so strong. This is precisely what made them so. Kody was always happy in unclear circumstances. As long as everything was nebulous, he was in charge. I can promise other homes. I can promise other women. But I can't tell you when or how I'm going to do it, was what he was saying. And not treating us equally is not a lack of regard. It's not that I don't want to. It's not that I'm opposed to it. Its paperwork doesn't allow that. Legal contracts are not influenced by charisma. They don't care about tone. They don't bend to ego. For the first time, Kody was no longer facing emotional discussions. Now he was facing structure. And that brought him face to face with how little structure he'd actually erected. As quoted by those who know what happened, Janelle's new husband has been a key behind-the-scenes player. He did not inject himself into family business or seek the spotlight. Rather, his focus was on the process. He encouraged Janelle to distinguish between emotions and entitlement, to examine what she'd contributed versus what she'd received. And there was an imbalance that could not be overlooked. Janelle was funding Coyote Pass while getting nothing in return. No home, no security, no progress. All while Kody was treating the land as a negotiable bargaining chip he could use for as long as he wanted. This plan fell through as soon as formal action was taken. Suddenly, Kody wasn't speaking to the person who would have accepted vague answers. He was speaking to the person who not only wanted answers but answers that had been documented. Timelines, clarity, answers, and that was a game changer. Family talk became serious conversation. Deadlines appeared on the horizon. Options had to be evaluated: sell, divide, or restructure ownership. Each narrowed the possibilities for stalling on Kody's part, but with each step he took forward, his power waned. What started happening was that the fans picked up on Kody ceased making confident references to Coyote Pass in interviews. The tone of his statements changed from one of ownership to frustration. There were fewer references to plans for the future and more references to problems. The land that represented his leadership began to represent problems he could not solve. In contrast, however, Janelle did not gloat. She didn't escalate. She didn't need to. Because the facts were doing the work for her. The more the particulars clarified, the more apparent it became that Kody's hold on Coyote Pass was contingent on Janelle's silence. And Janelle was no longer silent. It had nothing to do with revenge. It wasn't about punishment. This was about closure. Throughout the years, Janelle has been asked to make sacrifices in the name of family unity. Now, in the name of self-respect, the request for fairness was irretrievable. The only way Kody could react was to push back emotionally as well. He perceived this situation as a form of betrayal. He inferred that there was some type of disloyalty at play. He questioned motives. However, this was not as effective as some of his other communication approaches because of its familiarity to him, since emotion couldn't precede documentation. It was perhaps the first time in his life that Kody was dealing with results that weren't based on emotions but on facts. And this was stripping him of the power that he'd long known to be under his command. The earth could not remain frozen, the questions couldn't be ignored. But then the dream couldn't withstand examination. Coyote Pass was no longer a signal of what could be. It was a testament to what hadn't been done, and as the events progressed, one thing that became painfully clear: the man who once could dictate the future has very few options left. The delay that he used as leverage has suddenly become a liability. The lack of planning that he once waved as irrelevant has become a flaw. I could have done that, Rachel explained to Lucas. You see, I had someone like you in mind. It made all the difference. Someone like me? Lucas repeated. You mean like in the same situation? Yes, Rachel confirmed. People like me. Kody had lost the edge. Not because someone attacked him. Not because he was humiliated. But simply because someone asked the right questions and did not take no for an answer. Coyote Pass did not disintegrate overnight. It unraveled slowly, systematically, and publicly. Thus, with every document that was searched, every deadline that was established, and every excuse that was eliminated, Kody lost the basis of his dream. That which was his greatest glory has now become his worst shame. And with the reality of the situation dawned on them, there was one truth above all others: the peaceful vision that was once presented gradually evolved into the pressure cooker. And Coyote Pass was the only place where Kody Brown could not escape the effects of his own decision-making. Years before, the land had protected him. So long as it was an undeveloped property, it was a promise, not an outcome. It was a talking point, not a reality. It was a thing that Kody could stand on, point downrange at the horizon, and used to promote what's coming someday. It was this malleability that afforded him control over all of these things: expectations, time, and the women whose financial fortunes were still bound to this land. However, when Janelle stopped waiting for change, the foundations supporting that control started to shift. As soon as she called for real answers, this land was no longer symbolic, it was problematic. Coyote Pass was not only unfinished, but also stuck. Worse, it was stuck due to decisions that Kody had not made. The utilities were not determined. The lots had not been defined. The costs were not balanced. The longer everything was left in limbo, the clearer it became that the stalemate wasn't deliberate. I think it's avoidancy. As the pressure grew, Kody was discovering he was facing a force he never expected: momentum without him. Talk was being made that was not centered on his will. Decisions were being considered that didn't need his approval. And now the very land he once held as weapon was starting to work against him. Kody, instead of being the visionary leader, now seemed to be the roadblock. The energy changed. The fans picked up on this in front of and behind the camera. Kody's attitude shifted. Where he once spoke confidently about the future, he spoke in a more defensive manner. His answers looped around in circles. His frustration carried over into interviews. He spoke about misunderstandings, feeling attacked, but he never asserted to tackle the problem. Why had Coyote Pass been stagnant? Because there was no good answer. The more Janelle pushed for closure, the less Kody had places to hide. Putting up land to sell was to confront his own failure. Splitting it was to relinquish control. And keeping it frozen was no longer a possibility when it came to accepting legal and financial realities. Each way out ahead cost him something, and that's when the dream turned into a nightmare. Kody had always known that time was on his side. If he waited long enough, they would cool off, make new decisions, and settle down. But that was not something Janelle did. She hardened. And with that determination, a new reality was created, one that had implications for indecision. The land started to mean something entirely different from what Kody had in mind. Instead of unity, this flag symbolized division rather than legacy. It revealed stagnation rather than leadership. It emphasized avoidance. The grief of Coyote Pass intensified with each conversation. As Coyote resented the change, he also continued to be more isolated. But the rest of them are ready to turn the page. He was the only holdout in a story that had outgrown itself, and secretly, he knew this. For that reason, he stopped talking about it. No more grand lectures, no more confident declarations. He said there were no further future plans outlined for the cameras. Certainty was substituted with silence. However, Janelle pressed on. Not loudly, not dramatically, But definitively, she had no desire to penalize Kody, she simply needed an answer. The system that she was now operating in didn't care about her feelings or her status. Brown explained it was reacting to facts. Results weren't favorable to Kody. Either. All the unanswered questions led back to his leadership. All the postponements were a manifestation of his unwillingness to commit. All the complications were an indication that his leadership was quite fragile. When devoid of loyalty and patience, the land did not lie. As the talks escalated, there was a weakening of Kody's control over Coyote Pass, sources revealed. The decisions that Kody used to make alone must be ratified. This meant that Kody became a participant rather than a decision-maker, which was a great blow for a man who based his entire identity upon control and guidance. Such a change was disastrous. Kody was emotionally distraught, perceiving this situation as a betrayal. He raised questions about loyalty. He suggested that respect had been forfeited. However, this was difficult to justify. Accountability does not negate loyalty. Responsibility does not negate respect. The nightmare was not that he may lose the land. The nightmare was what the land would expose. Who had all along been bearing the weight, Jim said. Janelle had invested. Janelle had waited. Janelle had believed, but now, Janelle had finished sacrificing. Coyote Pass, originally envisioned as the preservation of Kody's legacy, wound up chronicling its dissolution. The vision he had marketed to the family was now the proof of failed promises and unfinished business. And no editing could conceal that fact. Each time it was brought up, there was tension. Each time it was mentioned, it was painful. It was supposed to represent a new beginning. Instead, it was a daily reminder of what wasn't. But while this was a lot for Kody to handle, Janelle was already beyond this reality. She did not rely on the land to outline her future anymore. Her past did not need the dream to condone it, and she didn't have to get Kody's approval to proceed. This in itself, the difference between an individual who holds on to control and one who holds on to clarity, was enough to change everything. Coyote Pass lost its sense of possibilities. It became a reckoning, a tally to be settled on a leadership that has never been, for promises never fulfilled, for an authority based upon patience that had exhausted itself. And amidst all this chaos, one thing had become embarrassingly clear: the land was not failing due to external stimuli. Because the man in charge refused to build, it failed. But by the time Kody understood what he was losing, the dynamics had changed. The nightmare was not approaching. In fact, it was already an actuality. And finally, the final chapter of Coyote Pass would no longer be authored by him alone. Because the dream that he once controlled was now being made without him. Janelle Brown was a winner. Not in the loud, dramatic, victory lap manner, but in the only way that really counts. She took back her life, her strength, and her future. And with it, Janelle Brown brought to light the fragility of Kody Brown's legacy. For so long, Kody had portrayed himself as the force behind something even greater than an individual relationship. He just rattled on and on about family, leadership, and vision. Coyote Pass was to be the living testament to that vision, land that would outlast the bickering and the filming crews. However, when it came to constructing something substantial, everything fell apart. So what Janelle's journey ultimately showed was that Kody's legacy had not been ruined by outsiders, or by critics, or by the collapse of plural marriage. It had been undone by inaction, by delay, by an unwillingness to translate words into action. And for the first time, Janelle refused to be the collateral damage of another person's unfinished business. As she began her new life with her new husband, the differences between the old life and the new became impossible to ignore. There was calm instead of chaos. There was planning instead of the possibility of things happening uncertainly. There was instead of the draining of emotions. This was more than a new relationship. It was a new norm. Her husband did not ask to control or be noticed. His thrust was not to define her past or to compete with it. Rather, he honored her past and simply protected her future. This, in and of itself, invalidated the story that Kody had told for so long, that he was the center, the glue that held everything together. Because Janelle was not falling apart without him. She was doing well. And that reality was painful enough without any argument ever being possible. However, Kody was left in the background of his own promise. The land that was once his legacy now represented nothing but unity and ambition. However, now the land represented loss. Loss of trust. Loss of authority. Loss of relevance. The most painful thing for Kody is not so much because Janelle has moved on. Jeremy explained. It's how she's done it. She didn't beg. She didn't attack. She didn't look back. She preferred clarity to chaos. In doing so, she rewrote the ending that Kody could have ever expected. Coyote Pass was meant to engrave his legacy in history. It was meant to immortalize his leadership. Instead, it recorded his failure to follow through. Each undelivered detail was a narrative he could not escape, a narrative of postponed choices, shattered timelines, and bashed relationships. The irony was impossible to overlook. The man who demanded loyalty lost loyalty. The man who proclaimed unity brought division, but the man who promised stability brought uncertainty. It wasn't about the win for evictions or the legal wins for Janelle either. It was about freedom. Freedom from waiting, freedom from justification, freedom from carrying the weight of indecision for another person for the first time in decades. Her future was no longer contingent on someone else's acceptance. She stood on her own, confident, supported, and secure. And Kody? He was faced with a reality that took him many years to avoid. There can't be leadership without accountability. Power without action is a diminishing force. Control without trust will soon disappear. The legacy he tried to leave behind certainly wasn't a legacy. It was an object lesson, he continued. It's an object lesson about what can happen when promises replace plans and ego replaces effort. Fans on the outside understood what was taking place. Janelle's saga was going from endurance to transformation. But so was Kody's. His saga was turning from frustration to deterioration. There was no dramatic courtroom finale. No explosive confrontation, only consequences. Janelle did not need an apology. Janelle needed closure. And in choosing herself, Janelle reached an understanding far more potent than the satisfaction of having won an argument. She gained her independence. This new life did not erase the past. It was a testament to the fact that she lived through it. Survival, combined with growth, would be the most crushing blow to Kody's control. Because nothing threatens power like someone who no longer needs it. Coyote Pass, however, was not lost to Kody. It outgrew him. Instead, it came to represent what was lost rather than what could have been. But as Janelle entered a future founded on collaboration and respect, Kody was left to hold on to a dream that was no longer his. It wasn't simply the conclusion to a dispute over property. It marked the end of an era, a generation that preferred promises over progress, where authority was unquestioned, where patience was mistaken for weakness. Janelle Brown ended that chapter calmly, confidently.